Okay, folks, here's a little revision video on 1916 Rising. So who was involved? The Irish Republican Brotherhood, that very small, secretive organisation dedicated to winning an Irish Republic through violence. The Irish Volunteer Force, or really, to be accurate, the volunteers, 10% of the original volunteers were left in Ireland. The rest all went on and joined the British Army, as they were asked to do by John Redmond at Wooden Bridge. The Irish Citizens Army was a organisation. Again, army is probably a uh, example of exaggeration, very small group of a few hundred men and women who were supporters of James Connolly, and they were socialists and wanted a socialist republic. And Cumann na mBan, which was essentially the women's arm of the volunteers. Personalities: Patrick Pearse, of course, parachuted in at the last minute to be the leader of the Rising, was a member of the IRB. Owen MacNeill was the leader of the volunteers who had refused to go and fight for Britain in World War One. James Connolly was leader of the Citizens' Army, and Constance Markievicz, was the leader of Cumann na mBan. So why did 1916 Rising happen? Well, there was this desire to win a fully independent 32-county Irish Republic. There was a sense that home rule, the British had promised us home rule, and then when we waited for home rule, they didn't give us home rule, and there was a sense that Britain would never keep her word, and also that even if we did get home rule, we'd still be part of Britain. So it was the desire for complete independence. And I suppose by the time the Rising happened, the people involved, the leadership involved, knew that it couldn't succeed. So the motive slightly changed in the week leading up to the Rising, and the motive then became, look, let's go out and sacrifice ourselves to show our countrymen, our countrywomen, our fellow citizens, that's important to sacrifice for the greater good. So this idea that we would shed our blood in order to inspire the next generation, that certainly was one of the motives for going ahead with the Rising, when we'll see in a moment they knew before they started that they couldn't succeed. Okay, so let's think about the planning. So the IRB Army Council was the main organising structure behind the Rising. People involved: Amy Cant, Tom Clark, Sean McDermott. They planned to seize control of the centre of Dublin, disrupting British communications. That's why they took the GPO, because the GPO was the centre of communications in Ireland. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have even telephones, but the GPO, whatever communications you had, the GPO was the centre of them. The idea was because the IRB was a very, very small organisation, it wouldn't be able to stage any sort of Rising, was to use the Irish volunteers who were, still in Ireland as the army to fight the Rising. And of course, in order to have a revolution, you need guns, and the idea was to get weapons from Germany. They didn't think there'd be any problem getting weapons from Germany, because Germany, of course, was at war with Britain at this period, and there was a slogan or an idea that Britain's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. So if Britain's over there fighting against Germany in World War Two or World War One, then Britain is weak, and we might be able to strike for independence. So that was the idea. Roger Casement was an Irish nationalist, a very, very well-known member of the British establishment, by the way, but actually an Irish nationalist. And Roger Casement was a member of the IRB, and he was sent to Germany to try to recruit soldiers for the Rising from amongst Irish prisoners of war who'd been captured by Germany during the First World War fighting for Britain. Almost all of them said, "Get lost, no, we wouldn't do that." And he wanted to obviously get arms from Germany. Germany did provide arms on a ship called the Aud, which was intercepted, and then later a Casement who landed in County Kerry was captured, and that was a total disaster because they hadn't got the weapons that they thought they needed in order to fight the Rising. The Rising was scheduled to start on Easter Sunday 1916, which was the 23rd of April, but Owen MacNeill, when he heard the news about the Aud, cancelled the manoeuvres. The plan was that the volunteers were always going out marching around Dublin. It wasn't an unusual sight to see them marching around Dublin, but the plan was to take the Brits by surprise, the British forces by surprise, by seizing these buildings. But MacNeill said, no, we're not going ahead, we haven't got the guns. And then the IRB Army Council decided to go ahead regardless on Easter Monday. So a much smaller group of rebels than planned or they intended took part. About 3,000 we think took part, we're not quite sure. They seized buildings around Dublin, the GPO, South Dublin Union, which today is the site of St James's Hospital, St Stephen's Green, the green part, famously, stupidly, was seized. These were very static targets, meaning that they were going to be easy to attack by the British. There was fierce fighting in certain places around the city during the week, particularly around the area of Mount Street Bridge, which is where the Grand Canal. It's a bridge across the Grand Canal into the centre of Dublin, up around Baggot Street on the south side of the city, where this unfortunate regiment of young conscript soldiers from the English Midlands, known as the Sherwood Foresters, were continually marched into the guns of a number of volunteers who were fighting there in using sniping tactics in buildings around Mount Street Bridge. And of course, famously, the commander of that part of the rising, that area around the south of the city, around about the canal, was Eamon de Valera, who went on to become one of the most famous figures in Irish history, even though he had very little to do with the Mount Street Bridge battle. The rising lasted 6 days, lads, like 6 days. It wasn't, had no chance of success. The British very quickly quashed the rebels by bringing a gunship down the Liffey. He went down about as far as where the customs house is, and basically launched in great big explosive shells in on top of the rebels on O'Connell Street, and much of Dublin city centre was destroyed, or certainly around the O'Connell Street area. And of course, many more people lived in the city centre then than they did today. So people's homes were destroyed. Most people who died were civilians caught up in the destruction of property. The rebels surrendered after 6 days. The leaders were brought to Kilmainham jail and executed. And this was a huge mistake by the British. They realised that after 15 of the rebels the leaders had been killed. And that's why De Valera, who was due to be executed, wasn't killed, because he happened to be next on the list when the Brits decided that they looked at public opinion. They saw the press reports of Pearse, Pearse being shot after writing a letter to his mother saying he was dying for Ireland, and Joseph Plunkett getting married to Grace Gifford in the church in Kilmainham jail the night before he's killed, and all these stories which created a sense that these were decent people dying for Ireland. And suddenly, sympathy, which the rebels had very little public sympathy, because people were angry with them because of the destruction of the city, and because of a sense that Irish soldiers who were fighting in the British Army were being betrayed, stabbed in the back. But that mood changed with the execution of the leaders and the decision by the British to arrest lots of young Irish men who were not involved in the rising, just in case they were. And that led to the rise of a political party who, up until that point, had been very obscure, called Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin had nothing to do with the rising whatsoever. Their leader was Arthur Griffith. He was, yes, an Irish separatist, but he was not involved in the rising. But the British media and the British government called the rising the Sinn Féin Rising, and that led to a start of support for Sinn Féin by people who were sympathetic with the rebels, and that led to 1918 and all that jazz that we look at in a different video. So look, there's your Patrick Pearse biography. I'll go through it really quickly. I won't do the Markowitz one. You already have that document. So who was Patrick Pearse? One of the leaders of 1916 Rising. He signed the proclamation. He read the proclamation outside the GPO on Easter Monday, 24th of April 1916. As a young person, he had a strong interest in the Irish language. He spent summers in Galway learning Irish. I'm sure some of you might have been down to see Pearse's cottage in Galway Gaeltacht. He joined the Gaelic League, which was an organisation designed to promote Irish language use, in 1896. He became editor of its newspaper on Clive Sullis in the early part of the 20th century, and he wanted to teach the Irish language to young people, and he set up one of the first Gael Scoilna in Ireland, which was St. Enda's or Scoilna in Rathfarnham. In 1913, he joined the Irish Volunteers. Shortly after, he became radicalised and became a member of the IRB. He became one of the leaders of the IRB on the Supreme Council. Shortly after he joined, it was a very small organisation. He was chosen as president of the Republic before the Easter Rising, probably because of his oratory skills. He famously gave a really famous speech over the graveside of a man called O'Donovan Rossa the year before, and was recognised as somebody who was really good at articulating Republican sentiment. So he was seen as a good choice as president. He was in charge of the GPO garrison on O'Connell Street during Easter week, along with James Connolly, and it was him who decided to surrender on the Saturday 29th of April. He was taken to Richmond Barracks, which is today known as Collins Barracks. He was court-martialed, sentenced to death, and he was shot dead on May 3rd, 1916 in the Stonebreakers Yard in Kilmainham Jail. Little bio of Patrick Pearse.